Hi, everybody. This is part two because I got a little bit rushed when I realized the first part of my reaction to this horrific video was an hour long. I mean, this video is only 20 minutes long, and I just went on a full blown rant. So, pardon me. I promised to talk to you guys about what the states' rights issues were in regards to the Civil War and why it was a states' rights issue fundamentally, which is what got us into the Civil War, although slavery was at the heart of it. Saying that slavery was not part of it is a lie. Saying that states' rights wasn't part of it is also a lie. And it's a lie because the North liked its slavery. So, first off, the biggest issue with slavery, as far as the North was concerned, wasn't the abolitionists saying slavery is bad. In fact, abolitionists were a minority of opinions in the North. Different people have run different studies. Some of them claim that fewer than 15% were abolitionists. Usually those studies are focused from southern universities and southern locations. Northern universities and northern locations will say upwards of 40% were abolitionists in the North. So that's something to take into consideration. I think it was probably maybe a quarter to a third of the country was actually anti-slavery. You were seen as a radical if you were an abolitionist in many ways. That's why even Grant, himself, who despised slavery, kept it really quiet. And he didn't really speak out until he was gifted a slave and he saw how she was treated by his father-in-law, and he immediately did something to free her. But he didn't do much else except, fight the war and then say slavery is over after the end of the war, etc., etc., etc. Well, what the South was doing was they were printing their own money. And part of that goes back to Thomas Jefferson, who completely destroyed the central federal government in terms of controlling currency and all that stuff. So the southern states were printing money, and money, I can't remember if I said that in the video that I kept. I know I said it in the video I deleted. Money is a note. It's a promissory note, which means that you are owed something by the government. So it's a loan. Essentially, it's like a IOU that the government gives to you, and the government says that I'm the government, come from the government, and I owe you something, and you can trade with other people the IOU based off of what I say you're worth. That's what money is. And it was even then, that was what it was even back then. Although back then we still used a precious metals standard. Now we use essentially our GDP and our ability to produce. The power of the American worker produces valuable contributions to society, and that's what we bank on with our money. It's not imaginary like a lot of people try and claim. It's a real thing. That way, the workforce and the value of the money scales with the population, which helps keeps inflation under control. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people aren't taught that. That's how money works. And so the South was printing money, saying I owe you, and then banking it against the federal reserve, essentially, is what they were doing. It wasn't really a federal reserve. You get what I mean. They're banking it against their own land and what the federal government owed them, and claiming, the federal government can pay my IOUs and debts because that's what statehood means. And so the the North was saying, you can't friggin' do this. And the South was saying, yes, we can. And the reason why they were becoming indebted due to slavery is that slaves were costing more and more and more, and trade with foreign countries like Britain, they were demanding cheaper and cheaper goods. So the South started producing cotton, for example, at a net loss. And as a result, the South, there some argument about the percentage, but the general consensus is, once again, upwards of a third of the southern states that broke off and became the Confederacy was owned based off of loans and promissory notes by the British government. And the British were heavily involved in instigating the debt of the South to a degree where the British Crown actually thought that they could regain control over the colonies, or at least the southern part of the United States, which they could then conduct a trade war and force the northern states to come in after they acquired the southern states. And that's because, as I said before, in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico specifically, 4 major ports that controlled that entire area. And if from, like Galveston and all the way over, that little bend in Texas, all the way over to the Florida Keys, they could literally squeeze out any and all valuable production of the Caribbean from any of the other countries. And one of the most valuable forms of production was sugar. And I don't know if you know this. If you don't, you now do. Sugar is a wartime commodity. Sugar is used to produce molasses, which is used as a high-grade lubricant back then for machinery and cannons and production of weapons, etc., etc., etc. So sugarcane was incredibly valuable. That whole trade was incredibly valuable, and Britain thought that they would reacquire this part of their empire. So their interference in the slave trade, the Southern desired to remain rich when they were actually incredibly poor, pushed the North into saying, okay, we're going after and we're going to end this states' rights bullshit where you think you can print your own money and conduct trade and as if you're an official emissary or ambassador of the United States. You're not. You're a state. You kneel to us, the main federal government, and the main federal government's the one that controls trade. Because even back then, European nations didn't necessarily recognize America, the United States of America, as a fully functional country yet. Because we really kind of weren't. And so that's what actually caused the Civil War. It's less than 100 years of independence. And so many things were not yet fully realized as a country. And the North said, no, you're not going to do this. And the South said, yes, we are. And the North said, okay, we're putting an end to slavery, which is your means to make money, when in reality it was your means to generate debt. But they only ended slavery for African chattel slavery, block and chain. What they didn't end was something that Unsolved Mysteries, bizarrely enough, went after with their lost loves and inspiring people to look for adoption records, foster records. See, what happened in the late 1800s, in early 1900s, as you would see on websites such as this and this, Bureau of Labor Statistics, is human trafficking forced slave labor of children, especially. Children working like as musicians, which they weren't really brutalized, or in factories, as seen here, where if your arms got a little bit too big, when the tiny little arms were supposed to fit inside the machinery, they'd get ripped off, broken, chopped off, or whatever. And part of the problem was the way adoption records were sealed, so that children were kidnapped, processed through, quote, legitimate adoption agencies, end quote, corrupt judges, etc. Children from one part of the city were stolen, shoved into sweatshops, or otherwise used, maybe even shipped across the country, all for the profit of some horrible, horrible people. And Unsolved Mysteries started going after those laws in a way that was really benign. They tried to connect people who were looking for their long-lost siblings. In the 80s, so the people who were 60 years old, 70 years old, 80 years old, were looking for family members who were facing laws that were created for child slave labor at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. And at one point, a lot of people don't remember this. At one point, prosecutors in New York and other areas in the industrialized North tried to sue Unsolved Mysteries for daring to even mention the idea of sealed adoption records, because that was creating a movement in the 80s to undo these laws that were a century old and designed solely for human trafficking and child slave labor. The North liked its slaves. The North didn't like the South selling the value of the country out from under them. That's the real reason why we entered the Civil War. And even Lincoln bided his time before he did something to address slavery, because he wasn't sure if he had the full support of the northern states. And that's when he did the Emancipation Proclamation. That's the history that this shit-eating video didn't tell you and completely fucked up. Anyway, love y'all. Take care. Have a wonderful day. As always, double check my work. And by the way, if you could travel back in time or look at old records of these prosecutors trying to making grand statements about going after TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries, which started the movement to undermine the sanctity of adoption. Now you know why they were going after them. Some of these people were families were still alive who were involved in those horrible human trafficking things, and that's why they tried to do it. And it's so funny because Unsolved Mysteries is just trying to unite people. Isn't that crazy? Love y'all. Take care. Bye.